Walter Prescott owned 600 acres of farmland, 3 grain elevators, and enough money to ensure that none of his children would ever have to worry about financial security. For nearly 50 years, he had built everything with his own hands alongside his wife, Margaret. But 14 months after Margaret died, Walter discovered something that hurt far more than grief. His children only seemed to call when they needed money. They only visited when they wanted advice, signatures, or help solving a problem. No one called simply to ask how he was doing. No one stopped by just to sit with him. At 72 years old, Walter decided to find out whether his children loved him or merely loved what he could provide. So he did something no one saw coming. He secretly transferred every major asset into a trust managed by his attorney. He abandoned the farmhouse he and Margaret had built together. He moved into an aging trailer on the far edge of his property. Then he called his 4 children and told them the same devastating story. The farm was gone. The money was gone. The future inheritance they expected had disappeared. And then Walter waited. For 9 long months, he watched. He listened. He recorded every phone call, every visit, every excuse, every act of kindness. By the end of that year, Walter would learn which child still cared when there was nothing left to gain. But the test would reveal something else, something Margaret had been trying to tell him for decades. The biggest failure in the family might not belong to his children at all. The Prescott family had not started with wealth. They had started with 80 acres, a leaking farmhouse, and a bank loan that kept Walter awake most nights. Back then, Walter was 24 years old and newly married to Margaret Ellis Prescott. The wedding had been so small that the reception was held in Walter's mother's kitchen. There were paper plates, homemade sandwiches, and a grocery store cake that leaned slightly to one side. Margaret loved it. She laughed through the entire evening and told Walter she would have married him under a tree if necessary. That was the thing about Margaret. She never cared much about what people owned. She cared about who they were. The farmhouse waiting for them after the honeymoon was barely standing. Rain leaked through the roof every spring. The windows rattled whenever Kansas winds swept across the prairie. The kitchen floor sloped enough that a marble could roll from one side of the room to the other. Most people would have seen problems. Margaret saw possibilities. While Walter worked the fields from sunrise until dark, Margaret painted walls, repaired curtains, and planted flowers around the porch. Little by little, the place began to feel like home. Years passed. The farm grew. 80 acres became 160. 160 became 300. Eventually, Prescott Ridge Farm stretched across 600 acres of rich Kansas farmland. Walter bought his first grain elevator when his oldest son, Andrew, was 6 years old. The second came nearly a decade later. The third followed after that. Success arrived slowly, then all at once. By the time Walter turned 50, people throughout the county knew the Prescott name. But while Walter built the business, Margaret built the family. Andrew was born first. Restless and ambitious, he always seemed to be looking beyond the horizon. Victoria arrived 2 years later. Sharp-minded and determined, she challenged teachers, coaches, and sometimes her parents. Nathan came next. Quiet and practical, he preferred tools and engines to conversations. And then there was Grace, the surprise child, the daughter Margaret often called her greatest blessing. The 4 children grew up, running through cornfields, helping with chores, and eating dinner together every night at the long wooden table in the farmhouse kitchen. Looking back, those years would seem almost perfect, but perfection has a way of hiding cracks. And some cracks take decades to appear. The cracks began to show when Margaret got sick. The diagnosis came on a Tuesday afternoon in early spring, stage 4 pancreatic cancer. The doctor delivered the news in a quiet examination room that smelled faintly of disinfectant and coffee. Walter remembered every detail of that day, except the drive home. For a long time afterward, he could not recall how he and Margaret had gotten from the hospital back to the farmhouse. Only one memory remained clear: Margaret reaching across the center console and taking his hand. She had always done that when life became difficult. She never cared much about what people owned. She cared about who they were. The following 9 months were the hardest of Walter's life. Chemotherapy weakened Margaret. Radiation exhausted her. Yet somehow, she remained the strongest person in every room she entered. She continued asking about the crops. She checked school photos sent by the grandchildren. She mailed birthday cards. She called relatives. She even continued reminding Walter to eat lunch when he became distracted by work. The children came during her illness, but not equally. Andrew flew in twice from Wichita. Both visits lasted less than 48 hours. He spent most of the time taking business calls and checking emails from his office. Victoria came once near Christmas. She stayed 3 days, but seemed unable to disconnect from work. Her laptop remained open almost constantly. Nathan stopped by more often, but his visits were short. He usually stood near the bedroom doorway, uncomfortable with hospitals, illness, and emotions he could not fix with tools. Only Grace came every weekend. Without fail, every Friday after work, she packed Emma and Jacob into the station wagon and drove nearly 3 hours to the farm. She brought casseroles, groceries, fresh coffee. Sometimes she simply sat beside Margaret's bed and read aloud from old novels they both loved. Margaret never complained about the others, not once, but Walter noticed. And because he noticed, he could never stop noticing. Margaret died on a warm July morning. The corn outside the bedroom window stood shoulder high. Sunlight filled the room. Walter held her hand when she took her final breath. Then he kept holding it long after she was gone. The funeral drew nearly 200 people. Farmers, business owners, neighbors, former teachers, church members, people whose lives Margaret had quietly touched over the years. Everyone seemed to have a story about her kindness. Everyone except Walter. Grief had hollowed him out so completely that he could barely speak. After the service, while people gathered outside the church, Walter saw something he couldn't forget. Andrew stood near the parking lot, talking to a commercial real estate developer from Wichita. Walter recognized the man immediately. The conversation seemed serious. As Walter passed nearby, he heard only a few words: property values, agricultural development, future opportunities. At his wife's funeral, Walter walked away before hearing more. Inside the fellowship hall, Victoria sat alone at a table, checking messages on her phone every few minutes. Nathan eventually approached Walter near the coat rack. He shuffled his feet awkwardly. "Have you started the insurance paperwork yet?" he asked. Walter stared at him. Not because the question was cruel, because it came too soon, far too soon. Nathan seemed to realize it immediately. His face reddened. He apologized and quickly changed the subject. But the damage lingered. Only Grace found Walter standing alone in the church kitchen. The faucet was running. He wasn't washing anything. He was simply staring into the sink. Without speaking, Grace reached over and turned off the water. Then she took his hand. No advice, no questions, no explanations. She simply stood beside him, and somehow that helped more than words ever could. The months after the funeral felt endless. The farmhouse grew quieter. The empty chair across the dinner table seemed larger every day. At first, Walter assumed grief was making him sensitive. But as summer turned into autumn, a troubling pattern emerged. Andrew called frequently, yet every conversation eventually drifted toward finances, investments, or future planning. Victoria called occasionally. Most conversations lasted less than 10 minutes. Nathan visited once, asking for help with cash flow problems at his repair shop. Grace called every Sunday evening, exactly at 6 o'clock, every single week. One lonely Thanksgiving afternoon, Walter sat by himself at the kitchen table, eating turkey from a paper plate. Margaret's chair sat empty across from him. The silence felt unbearable, and for the first time, Walter allowed himself to ask a question he had been avoiding for months. Without Margaret holding the family together, did his children actually care about him anymore? Or had they only cared about what he could provide? That question followed him into winter, and before long, it would change everything. Winter arrived early that year. Cold winds swept across the Kansas prairie, rattling the farmhouse windows and carrying dry snow across the harvested fields. Walter spent most evenings alone. The television played in the background more for noise than entertainment. The house felt too large now, too quiet. Every room carried traces of Margaret. Her reading glasses still rested on a shelf beside the living room chair. Her favorite coffee mug sat in the cabinet exactly where she had left it. The quilt she had sewn years earlier remained folded neatly across the foot of their bed. Walter avoided touching any of it. Some grief felt manageable from a distance. One snowy evening in January, he finally decided to sort through Margaret's closet. The church was collecting clothing for families in need. Margaret would have wanted her things to help someone. At least that was what Walter told himself. He worked slowly. Each sweater carried memories. Each coat reminded him of a season they had shared. Halfway through the closet, he reached for a hat box on the upper shelf. Something slipped behind it. A leather-bound journal fell forward. Walter caught it before it hit the floor. For a moment, he simply stared at it. He had seen Margaret writing in that journal countless times. At the kitchen table, on the porch, beside her hospital bed, but he had never asked what she wrote. The journal felt strangely heavy in his hands. Walter sat on the edge of the bed and opened it. The first entries were ordinary. Weather notes, recipes, comments about crop yields, stories about grandchildren. He smiled at several passages. Margaret had a gift for finding beauty in small moments. Then he turned to an entry dated 3 years before her diagnosis. The smile disappeared. A man's children should come to see him because they want to, not because there is something to sign. Walter read the sentence twice, then a third time. The words continued. Ray thinks providing is the same thing as loving. He has spent 40 years taking care of everyone financially, but he never learned how to tell them he loves them. And because of that, the children speak his language now. They speak in transactions. Walter stared at the page. A strange pressure formed in his chest. Margaret had never said these things directly. Or perhaps she had. Perhaps he simply hadn't listened. He turned more pages. The pattern continued. Entries describing family dinners, birthday visits, phone calls. Again and again, Margaret observed the same thing. Walter handled practical problems. She handled emotional ones. Walter solved financial emergencies. She maintained relationships. Walter built the farm. She built the family. Near midnight, Walter closed the journal. The house was silent. Outside, snow drifted across the fields. Inside, Margaret's words echoed through every room. For the first time, Walter wondered whether the distance between himself and his children had started long before Margaret died. Maybe she had been protecting all of them for decades. The next morning, Walter drove into town. The roads were icy. The sky hung low and gray above the prairie. His destination was a small brick office above a pharmacy on Main Street. Theodore Blake had served as the Prescott family attorney for over 30 years. He knew every acre Walter owned, every trust, every contract, every mistake. When Walter entered, Theodore looked up from his desk and smiled. "You look terrible," he said. Walter sat down. "I need your help." Theodore removed his glasses. That immediately got his attention. Walter rarely asked anyone for help. "What happened?" Walter placed Margaret's journal on the desk. Then he explained everything. The loneliness, the phone calls, the funeral, the questions about money, the growing suspicion that his children only saw him as a provider. Finally, he explained his idea. As Walter talked, Theodore's expression changed from curiosity to disbelief. When he finished, silence filled the office. The attorney leaned back slowly. "No," Walter frowned. "No? It's a terrible idea." Walter crossed his arms. "Why?" "Because you're talking about deceiving your children. I'm talking about learning the truth." "You think they're the same thing?" Walter looked away. Theodore sighed heavily. "What exactly do you want to do?" Walter took a deep breath. Every major asset would be transferred temporarily into a protected trust. The farm income would continue operating normally behind the scenes. The grain elevators would remain active. Nothing would actually change, except appearances. Walter would move into the old Prairie Creek trailer on the north edge of the property. Then he would tell his children the farm had failed. Bankruptcy, debt, financial collapse, gone. Everything gone. And then he would wait. Theodore stared at him for a long moment. Finally, he rubbed his forehead. If we do this, there's no way to predict what happens next. Walter nodded. I know. The attorney looked at Margaret's journal, then at the tired man sitting across from him. And for the first time, Theodore realized this wasn't really about money. It was about a grieving husband searching for proof that he still mattered. 3 weeks later, the paperwork was ready, and Walter Prescott was preparing to disappear from his own life. Walter Prescott moved into the Prairie Creek trailer on the first day of September. The trailer sat on the northern edge of Prescott Ridge Farm, nearly a mile from the farmhouse. Years earlier, seasonal workers had used it during harvest season. Now it looked forgotten. The white paint had faded. The aluminum siding was dented. One of the windows had a crack running through the corner. Inside, the space felt smaller than Walter remembered. A narrow kitchen, a worn couch, a fold-down table, a bedroom barely large enough for a bed and dresser. For the first time in nearly 50 years, Walter was living somewhere Margaret had never touched. The realization hit him harder than expected. He brought only a few things with him: some clothes, a coffee maker, Margaret's photograph, and her journal. Everything else remained inside the farmhouse, waiting. The afternoon passed slowly as he unpacked. By evening, the trailer felt less like a temporary shelter and more like a reality he had chosen for himself. At sunset, Walter sat alone at the fold-down table. 4 names were written on a yellow notepad: Andrew, Victoria, Nathan, Grace. It was time. He picked up the phone and called Andrew first. His oldest son answered on the 3rd ring. Dad? Andrew sounded distracted. Walter could hear office noise in the background. Voices. Keyboards. Phones ringing. Walter delivered the story exactly as he and Theodore had rehearsed. Poor investments. Debt. Several bad years. The farm was gone. The grain elevators were gone. The bank had taken everything. Silence followed. 5 long seconds. Then Andrew exhaled heavily. How could this happen? Walter looked down at the table. It happened. No, Dad. 600 acres doesn't just disappear. I made mistakes. Andrew began asking questions immediately. How much debt? What assets remained? What about the equipment? The mineral rights? The property value? Walter answered carefully. Nothing. Everything gone. Finally, Andrew sighed. I need some time to think. The call ended 8 minutes later. Not once had Andrew asked how Walter was doing. Walter made a small mark beside his son's name. Then he called Victoria. She answered almost immediately. Dad? Is everything okay? Walter repeated the story. This time the silence sounded different. Victoria seemed genuinely shocked. Oh my God. For a moment, Walter thought she might cry. Instead, she asked, What's your plan? I don't know yet. You need a plan. She began discussing retirement communities, financial advisors, possible government assistance. The conversation felt practical, organized, professional, like a meeting. When the call ended, Walter stared at the phone. Victoria had sounded concerned, but concerned about the situation. Not necessarily about him. He made another note. Next came Nathan. The phone rang 6 times before his son answered. A compressor hummed loudly somewhere in the background. Dad? Walter told the story. The reaction was immediate. What about the money? Walter blinked. What money? The money you promised to leave us someday. The words came out before Nathan could stop them. Silence followed. Heavy and uncomfortable. Nathan cleared his throat. That's not what I meant. But both men knew exactly what he had meant. Walter continued the story. There was no inheritance, no savings, nothing left. Nathan's breathing changed. Panic replaced embarrassment. The repair shop had been struggling. Walter knew that. What he hadn't known was how badly. When the call ended, Nathan sounded frightened. Not angry, not disappointed, frightened. Walter placed the phone down carefully. 3 calls completed. 3 reactions. None of them had asked the question he secretly hoped to hear. The trailer seemed quieter now. Darkness pressed against the windows. Outside, wind moved through the fields. Walter looked at the final name, Grace. His finger hovered over the number. Then he pressed call. His youngest daughter answered on the second ring. "Hi, Dad." Her voice carried the same warmth Margaret once had. Walter almost lost his nerve. For a moment, he considered abandoning the entire plan. Instead, he told the story. Every detail, every lie. The farm was gone. The money was gone. He was living in the trailer. When he finished, silence filled the line. But unlike the others, Grace's silence didn't feel like calculation. It felt like listening. Finally, she spoke. Only 4 words. "Are you safe, Dad?" Walter closed his eyes. The question landed somewhere deep inside him. "I'm fine. Are you eating?" "Yes." "Good." Another pause. Then her voice became firm. "I'm coming Saturday." "You don't need to." "I'm coming." The certainty reminded him so much of Margaret that his throat tightened. "It's a 3-hour drive." "I know." "You have work." "I know." "You have the kids." "I know." Walter couldn't think of anything else to say. Grace softened slightly. "Just make coffee." Despite everything, Walter found himself smiling. "I can do that." The call ended. The trailer fell silent again. For several minutes, Walter remained seated at the table. Then he opened a small notebook. Under each name, he wrote exactly what had happened. Andrew. "How could this happen?" Victoria. "What's your plan?" Nathan. "What about the money?" Grace. "Are you safe?" Walter closed the notebook. Outside, darkness had settled completely across the prairie. The test had begun, and already the answers were starting to appear. Grace arrived the following Saturday morning. Walter heard the familiar sound of her station wagon long before he saw it. The gravel road leading to the Prairie Creek trailer curved through a stretch of open pasture, and the sound of tires crunching over stone carried across the quiet countryside. For reasons he could not explain, Walter found himself standing at the trailer window waiting. When the car finally appeared, Emma and Jacob were already waving through the back windows. A moment later, Grace stepped out carrying 2 reusable grocery bags. She looked at the trailer. Then she looked at her father. The concern on her face was immediate. Not pity. Concern. "Dad!" She climbed the steps and wrapped her arms around him before he could protest. Walter hugged her back. For a brief second, he felt something he had not felt since Margaret died. Home. Grace pulled away and studied him carefully. "You look tired." "I'm fine." "You always say that." She carried the groceries inside without waiting for permission. Milk, eggs, bread, soup, coffee, fresh fruit, several frozen meals. Grace opened cabinets and quietly stocked every shelf. She never commented on how little food she found. Walter noticed that too. Emma and Jacob quickly transformed the trailer. Jacob discovered grasshoppers in the field behind the property and spent most of the morning chasing them. Emma sat beside Walter and showed him drawings she had made during the week. For the first time in months, laughter filled the space. At lunchtime, Grace made sandwiches. They sat around the small fold-down table. Walter told the bankruptcy story again, the version he had memorized. Bad investments, debt, poor decisions, financial collapse. Grace listened without interrupting. When he finished, she stirred her coffee quietly. Then she asked a question. Not about money, not about land, not about the future. "What do you need?" Walter stared at her. The simplicity of the question caught him off guard. "I don't know." "Okay," she nodded. "We'll figure it out." "We, not you, not me. We." That evening, after Grace and the children left, Walter opened his notebook. Under her name, he wrote, "First visit. Brought groceries, brought the children, asked what I needed. No questions about money. No questions about inheritance." The next visitor arrived 10 days later. Andrew. Walter recognized his son's luxury sedan immediately. The polished vehicle looked strangely out of place beside the aging trailer. Andrew stepped out wearing pressed slacks and expensive shoes that seemed completely unsuited for gravel roads. He stood in silence for several seconds studying the trailer. Then he looked across the surrounding acreage. Walter recognized the expression. Assessment. Evaluation. Calculation. Andrew entered the trailer and sat down briefly. The visit lasted less than 2 hours. Most of the conversation centered on finances, possible debt restructuring, asset recovery, remaining land values, future options. At one point, Andrew even asked whether any mineral rights remained attached to the property. Walter answered every question according to the story. Nothing left, nothing salvageable. When Andrew finally left, Walter realized his son had never asked whether the trailer had heat. He had never asked whether Walter was lonely. He had never asked whether he needed help. That evening, another entry appeared in the notebook. Andrew visited, discussed assets, discussed property. No personal questions. As September turned into October, the pattern continued. Victoria called twice. Both conversations lasted less than 10 minutes. She suggested financial planning programs and retirement options. Her concern sounded sincere, but distant, like someone managing a problem rather than comforting a parent. Nathan remained mostly silent. That worried Walter more than anything. The few conversations they had were strained. Nathan sounded exhausted, distracted. One afternoon, he admitted business had slowed dramatically at the repair shop. Customers were delaying repairs. Bills were piling up. Walter wanted to help. The urge surprised him with its strength. More than once, he nearly called Theodore and ended the entire experiment. But each time he remembered Margaret's journal. The children speak in transactions because that's the language they learned. The words haunted him. Weeks passed. The notebook grew thicker. Phone calls, visits, excuses, observations. Every interaction found its way onto the pages. Yet one name appeared more often than all the others combined. Grace. Every Saturday she came. Sometimes with groceries, sometimes with homemade meals, sometimes with nothing except her children and several hours of her time. She fixed loose cabinet hinges. She replaced burned-out light bulbs. She brought fresh coffee. She listened. And every time she left, the trailer felt emptier than before. One chilly October evening, Walter sat alone reading through the notebook. Andrew had 3 entries. Victoria had 4. Nathan had 2. Grace already filled several pages. Walter closed the book and stared out the trailer window. The prairie grass moved gently beneath the setting sun. For the first time since beginning the test, he felt something dangerous. Not satisfaction, not vindication. Guilt, because with every passing week, the notebook was proving one thing beyond question. One of his children was showing up, and the others were slowly disappearing. Winter arrived quietly. One morning, Walter woke to find a thin layer of frost covering the inside corners of the trailer windows. The fields beyond the glass had turned silver beneath the early sunlight. The prairie looked beautiful. It also looked cold, very cold. The aging furnace inside the Prairie Creek trailer worked when it felt like working. Some nights it rattled and groaned for hours. Other nights it seemed determined to test Walter's patience. By December, he had learned to sleep wearing 2 flannel shirts and a heavy sweater. The farmhouse waiting for them after the honeymoon was barely standing, at least not aloud. Every Saturday, Grace continued to arrive. The weather didn't matter. Rain, snow, freezing winds. Nothing stopped her. Walter found himself looking forward to Saturdays in a way that embarrassed him. He would wake early, make coffee, straighten the trailer. Sometimes he even checked the clock, as if counting the minutes until her arrival. One snowy morning, Grace pulled into the driveway with a large cardboard box in the back of her station wagon. Emma and Jacob helped carry it inside. "What is all this?" Walter asked. Grace smiled. "A project." She opened the box. Inside were blue curtains, handmade. The fabric was thick enough to block drafts from the trailer windows. "You made these?" Grace nodded. "After the kids went to bed." Walter touched the material. The stitches weren't perfect. Some seams wandered slightly. But they had been made with care, the same kind of care Margaret once put into everything. Together they hung the curtains over the largest window. The change was small, yet somehow the trailer felt warmer immediately, more personal, less temporary. That night, after Grace and the children left, Walter stared at the curtains for a long time. Then he opened the notebook. Grace brought handmade curtains, spent 6 hours here. asked nothing in return. The entries were becoming repetitive, not because Grace lacked imagination, because kindness repeated itself week after week, month after month, unlike the others. Andrew called twice during December. The first conversation focused on possible buyers for portions of the property. The second involved tax implications connected to bankruptcy proceedings. Walter listened, answered, hung up. Then wrote another note. Property. Money. Business. Nothing else. Victoria sent a Christmas card. The message inside was thoughtful, polite, beautifully written, yet it somehow felt like something prepared during a lunch break between meetings. She also called on Christmas Eve. The conversation lasted exactly 9 minutes. Walter timed it without meaning to. Afterward, he hated himself for noticing. Nathan remained largely absent. That absence worried Walter more each week. When they did speak, Nathan sounded tired, defeated. The repair shop's financial problems appeared to be growing worse. Rebecca had reportedly taken additional hours at work. Bills continued to pile up. Several times Walter almost ended the test. Several times he almost called Theodore. Several times he almost wrote a check. Each time he stopped himself, because the question remained unanswered. Who would still come if there was nothing left to gain? A few days before Christmas, Samuel Whitaker stopped by the trailer. Walter's lifelong friend entered carrying 2 thermoses of coffee and a package of bacon from his freezer. The old rancher took one look around the trailer and shook his head. "You really committed to this foolishness," Walter laughed. "Good morning to you, too." Samuel poured coffee and sat down. For a while they talked about weather, cattle prices, and local politics. Eventually Samuel leaned back. "How long are you planning to keep this up?" Walter knew exactly what he meant. "As long as necessary." Necessary for what? Walter looked toward the blue curtains. "For the truth," Samuel snorted. "You already have it." "No." "Yes, you do." The rancher pointed toward the notebook resting on the counter. "One daughter keeps showing up. The others mostly don't. What more are you looking for?" Walter didn't answer. Samuel studied him carefully. Then he asked a question that lingered long after he left. "Are you testing your children, Walter?" Walter frowned. "Of course." Samuel slowly shook his head. "I don't think so anymore." "What does that mean?" The old rancher stood, pulled on his coat, then paused beside the door. "I think you started with a test." He opened the door. Cold air rushed inside. "But now you're punishing yourself." The trailer fell silent after Samuel left. Walter sat alone at the table. The words echoed in his mind. Punishing yourself. For the first time since beginning the experiment, he wondered if Samuel might be right. Outside, snow drifted across the empty fields. Inside, the blue curtains moved gently in the warm air from the furnace. Margaret's journal rested beside the notebook. 2 records of the same family. One written by a wife. One written by a husband. And somewhere between those pages, a truth was waiting. A truth Walter was not yet ready to face. But winter had only begun. And before it ended, that truth would become impossible to ignore. January settled over Kansas like a heavy blanket. The cold seemed endless. Wind swept across the prairie day and night, rattling the trailer walls and slipping through tiny cracks that no amount of insulation could completely stop. Walter's mornings became slower. His knees ached. His shoulders stiffened. Some days it took several minutes before his body felt willing to move. Still, he told everyone he was fine. That had always been his answer. Fine. The same word he had used when harvests failed. Rain leaked through the roof every spring. When Margaret was diagnosed with cancer. Fine. By the 3rd week of January, the cough began. At first it seemed harmless. A little irritation. Nothing more. Walter ignored it. He drank coffee, worked crossword puzzles, walked short distances around the property. The cough remained. 3 days later, it deepened. His chest felt tight. Breathing became difficult. Even climbing the trailer steps left him exhausted. On Sunday evening, Grace called at exactly 6 o'clock, as she always did. Walter answered. The moment he spoke, she knew something was wrong. "Dad, I'm here." "You sound awful." "It's just a cold." There was a pause. Then Grace sighed. The sound reminded him so much of Margaret that he almost smiled. No.
What?
No, it's not. I'm fine. You keep using that word. Walter looked out the window. Snow covered the fields. The world appeared frozen. I'll get over it. Grace's voice became firm. I'm coming tomorrow. You have work. I'll figure it out. You don't need to drive all the way. I'll be there at 8. The line went quiet. The discussion was over. Walter knew that tone. Margaret had used it for decades. The next morning, Grace arrived exactly at 8. One look at Walter's face ended the argument before it started. An hour later, they were sitting inside a medical clinic in town. The diagnosis came quickly. Pneumonia. The doctor recommended hospitalization. Walter refused immediately. Grace argued. The doctor argued. Walter remained stubborn. Eventually, a compromise was reached. Antibiotics, strict rest, close monitoring. Grace would stay. For the next 4 days, she practically moved into the trailer. She called the school and arranged for a substitute teacher. She canceled lesson plans, postponed responsibilities, never once complained. At night, she slept on the couch. Every few hours, she woke to check his temperature. She cooked soup, prepared medicine, filled a humidifier, and somehow managed to keep the small trailer feeling less like a sick room and more like a home. On the second day, Daniel arrived. Walter heard his truck before seeing it. His son-in-law climbed out carrying sheets of insulation and a toolbox. "What are you doing?" Walter asked. "Making sure this place doesn't kill you." Daniel spent the entire afternoon crawling beneath the trailer, sealing gaps, repairing loose panels, blocking cold air. When he finally finished, he walked inside, covered in dust, and smiled. There, Walter looked around. "What's different?" "You'll notice tonight." He did. For the first time all winter, the trailer held heat. That evening, Walter watched Grace grading papers at the table while Daniel helped Jacob with homework. For a moment, the trailer resembled a family home. The sight stirred something painful inside him. Something close to gratitude, something close to regret. On the 4th morning, Walter's fever finally broke. His breathing improved. His strength slowly returned. Grace was making coffee when the phone rang. Walter glanced at the screen. "Andrew," he answered. "Morning." "Dad, I've got some information." Walter closed his eyes. "Of course." Andrew immediately launched into a discussion about a development company purchasing agricultural property throughout the region. Several parcels near Prescott Ridge Farm had already received offers. The prices were impressive, even during bankruptcy, even during foreclosure. Walter listened quietly. Finally, he interrupted. "Andrew." "What?" "I've had pneumonia." Silence. For a second, Walter thought the call might change direction. "Oh." Another pause. "Are you okay?" "Getting better." "Good." More silence. Then Andrew cleared his throat. "Well, if any land remains under your control, we should talk about those offers." The conversation ended 5 minutes later. Walter stared at the phone. Grace had spent 4 nights sleeping on a couch. Daniel had crawled beneath a freezing trailer. Andrew had called about real estate. The contrast felt impossible to ignore. That evening, Walter opened the notebook. Under Andrew's name, he wrote, "Learned about pneumonia. Did not offer to visit. Called about land opportunity." Then he closed the notebook. For a long time, he sat in silence. Eventually, he reached for Margaret's journal. The leather cover felt familiar now, comforting. He opened to a random page. The entry was dated nearly 5 years before her diagnosis. Walter read slowly. "Ray loves the children. I've never doubted that, but he loves them the way the land loves rain, quietly, from underneath, without words. The problem is that children need more than provision. They need presence." Walter read the sentence twice. Then again. Outside, snow drifted across the fields. Inside, Grace laughed softly at something Jacob said. The sound filled the trailer. For the first time, Walter began to wonder whether the test was revealing something much larger than which child loved him most. Maybe it was revealing why the distance existed in the first place. And maybe that distance had started with him. By February, the snow had begun to melt. Patches of brown earth appeared across the prairie. breaking through the white blanket that had covered the land for months. The season was changing. Walter could feel it, not only outside, inside himself as well. His strength slowly returned after the pneumonia. The cough faded. His breathing improved. But something else had settled into him during those long winter weeks. A growing awareness he could no longer ignore. Every evening, after Grace returned home and the trailer became quiet again, Walter opened Margaret's journal. At first he had searched for comfort, now he searched for answers, and Margaret kept giving them to him. One entry described Andrew as a teenager. Walter remembered the day immediately. Andrew had won a statewide business competition during his senior year of high school. Margaret had driven 3 hours to attend the ceremony. Walter had stayed home to finish paperwork for a grain contract. The contract had been profitable. The memory had faded. Until now. Margaret's words brought it back. Andrew stood on that stage, looking for his father in the audience. I watched him search every row before he accepted the award. He smiled anyway. But I saw the disappointment. Walter closed his eyes. He remembered telling himself he would make it up later. Later never came. Another entry described Victoria's first year of college. She had called home frequently, at first, then less often, then rarely. Margaret wrote, Victoria says talking to her father feels like giving a business report. She tells him her grades, her plans, her goals. She never tells him her fears because she doesn't think he wants to hear them. Walter stared at the page. The words felt like a mirror he had spent years avoiding. He turned to another entry. Nathan, age 14. Baseball season. Nathan hit a home run today. He looked into the stands afterward. I don't think he was looking for me. Walter remembered exactly where he had been that afternoon. Repairing equipment, preparing for planting season, working, always providing, always convincing himself there would be time later. The journal rested open in his lap. Outside, water dripped steadily from melting snow. Inside, silence filled the trailer. For the first time, Walter understood something Margaret had been trying to tell him all along. The test wasn't exposing strangers. It was exposing the children he had helped create. Andrew had learned to value achievement because Walter valued achievement. Victoria buried herself in work because Walter had always placed work first. Nathan asked for financial help because money was the primary language Walter had used throughout his life. Only Grace seemed different, and even that realization hurt because Grace had not learned compassion from him. She had learned it from Margaret. A week later, another piece of news arrived. Not from one of his children, from Grace. They were sitting at the trailer table drinking coffee when she casually mentioned Nathan. Rebecca called me. Walter looked up. What happened? Grace hesitated. The pause told him everything. The repair shop closed. Walter felt something tighten inside his chest. When? 3 weeks ago. 3 weeks. His son had lost everything 3 weeks earlier, and Walter had known nothing about it. He didn't tell me. No. Grace stared into her coffee. I don't think he knows how. The word struck harder than intended. Walter looked away. Neither of them spoke for several moments. Finally, Grace continued. He's working part-time at an auto parts store now. Walter imagined Nathan stocking shelves. A man who had spent years building his own business, reduced to starting over. The image haunted him. That night, he couldn't sleep. The trailer creaked softly in the wind. Moonlight filtered through the blue curtains Grace had sewn. Walter sat at the table, reading through the notebook. Page after page, observation after observation. Phone calls, visits, silences. Excuses. By now, Grace's section filled most of the book. Andrew's entries remained focused on assets and opportunities. Victoria's entries were brief and infrequent. Nathan's entries were sparse, but increasingly painful. For months, Walter had treated the notebook like evidence, proof. Now it felt different. Now it felt like a record of wounds. Some inflicted by his children, many inflicted by himself. Near midnight, he opened Margaret's journal one final time. The page he found seemed almost impossible. It had been written years before her diagnosis, years before the trailer, years before the test. If something ever happens to me, I'm afraid Walter will retreat into the farm. The children will retreat into their own lives, and everyone will wait for someone else to bridge the distance. No one will, because I've been building that bridge for 40 years. Walter sat motionless. The words blurred slightly as tears filled his eyes. Margaret had seen it all coming. Every bit of it. The loneliness, the distance, the misunderstandings, the experiment. Even this moment, for the first time since moving into the trailer, Walter realized the test had gone on long enough. The answer had been clear for months. Grace kept showing up. The others did not. But that was no longer the most important truth. The most important truth was that he had spent decades expecting love to grow automatically from sacrifice. Margaret had known better. Relationships required presence, attention, effort. And he had often left those things to her. Walter closed both books, the notebook, the journal, one written by a grieving husband, the other by a wife who had understood everything long before he did. Then he picked up his phone. There was only one call he needed to make. The test was over. Now came the difficult part, telling the truth. The family meeting was scheduled for the first Saturday in June. Walter didn't explain why. He simply called Grace and asked her to contact everyone. All 4 children. No exceptions. Grace agreed without asking questions. By now she had learned to recognize certain tones in her father's voice. This one carried finality. The following week moved slowly. Walter returned to the farmhouse for the first time in months. Samuel Whitaker helped prepare the house. Windows were opened. Dust was wiped away. The kitchen was cleaned. Fresh coffee waited on the counter. For the first time since Margaret's death, the farmhouse felt alive again. On Saturday morning, Walter stood in the kitchen staring at the long wooden table. Margaret's table. The place where birthdays had been celebrated. Homework had been completed. Arguments had begun and ended. The place where his family had once gathered without needing a reason. Now they needed one. Grace arrived first, as she always did. Emma and Jacob ran through the yard, while Daniel helped Samuel carry supplies inside. Grace stepped into the kitchen and paused. Her eyes moved slowly around the room. Then they settled on Walter. "You okay?" Walter nodded. "I think so." A few minutes later, Andrew arrived. His sedan rolled into the driveway precisely 10 minutes before the meeting. Victoria followed shortly afterward. Nathan arrived last. His truck looked older than Walter remembered. So did Nathan. Life had not been gentle with him. By 10 o'clock, all 4 children stood inside the farmhouse kitchen. For a moment, nobody spoke. The silence felt unfamiliar. Andrew crossed his arms. Victoria sat at the table. Nathan remained near the doorway. Grace waited quietly. Walter looked at each of them. Then he took a deep breath. The farm didn't fail. The room froze. No one moved. No one spoke. Walter continued. "The grain elevators are operating. The land is still mine. The investments are intact. There was never a bankruptcy." Andrew's face changed first. Shock. Then confusion. Then anger. "What?" Walter forced himself to continue. "I lied." The words landed heavily. "I lied about everything." Victoria stared at him. Nathan looked as if someone had punched him. Grace closed her eyes briefly. Perhaps she had already suspected something. Walter placed the notebook on the table. The same notebook he had carried for 9 months. "I wanted to know who would still come if I had nothing left to offer." Andrew pushed away from the counter. "You tested us?" Walter nodded. The anger in Andrew's eyes intensified. "You let us believe you'd lost everything?" "Yes." "You sat in that trailer keeping score?" Walter looked down at the notebook. "Yes." For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then Walter opened the notebook. His hands trembled slightly. "Andrew." The room remained silent. "You visited once." Walter turned pages. "You discussed property values, debt restructuring, mineral rights, and development opportunities." Andrew stared at the floor. "You never asked whether I was lonely." Walter swallowed hard. "You never asked if I needed anything." The words hung in the air. Then Walter turned another page. "Victoria." She lowered her eyes. "You called 3 times." He read the dates, the durations, the subjects. "You suggested plans. You suggested facilities. You suggested solutions." His voice softened. "But you never visited." Victoria's jaw tightened. Tears appeared unexpectedly in her eyes. Walter turned again. Nathan, this section hurt the most. You came once? Nathan's shoulders slumped. You asked about hidden accounts. Walter paused. Then you lost your business. Nathan looked away. I didn't know. Walter's voice cracked. I didn't know because you didn't tell me. Nathan finally looked up. Pain filled his eyes. I was ashamed. The room fell silent. Raw honesty had entered the conversation. For the first time, Walter closed the notebook. He no longer needed it. Then he looked at Grace, his youngest daughter, the child who had inherited Margaret's heart. Grace drove 3 hours every Saturday. His voice grew unsteady. She brought groceries. She fixed things. She brought her children. When I got pneumonia, she stayed for 4 days. Daniel looked away. Grace remained silent. She never once asked about money. Walter felt tears gathering. Not once. No one moved. Outside, Emma laughed somewhere in the yard. The sound drifted through an open window. A reminder of everything that truly mattered. Andrew finally spoke. His voice was lower now, less angry, more wounded. You should have talked to us. Walter nodded. I know. Victoria wiped her eyes. I kept telling myself I'd visit when work slowed down. A bitter smile crossed her face. It never slowed down. Nathan spoke next, barely above a whisper. I didn't come because I was embarrassed. His hands trembled. Every time I called you, I needed something. He stared at the floor. I didn't know how to call if I didn't. Walter felt something break inside him. Not anger, not disappointment, understanding. Then Grace stood. For the first time all morning, she looked at her father, then at her siblings. Finally, she spoke. We're all acting like someone failed a test. Everyone turned toward her. Grace shook her head. That's not what happened. Her voice remained calm. We all failed. The room became completely still. Grace looked directly at Walter. Mom spent 40 years holding this family together. Tears filled her eyes. And when she died, none of us knew how. Walter felt the truth of those words immediately. Like sunlight breaking through clouds. Grace continued. Andrew hid inside work. Victoria hid inside work. Nathan hid inside his problems. She paused. And Dad hid inside the farm. No one argued. Because no one could. For the first time in years, every person in that room was looking directly at the truth. Not the version they preferred. The real version. Walter lowered himself into a chair, suddenly exhausted. I thought providing for all of you was enough. His voice shook. It wasn't. He looked at Andrew. I'm proud of you. Andrew blinked. The words seemed unfamiliar. Walter turned toward Victoria. I'm sorry I wasn't there. Then Nathan. I'm sorry I didn't teach you how to come to me for anything besides money. Tears rolled down Nathan's face. Nobody tried to hide anymore. The defenses were gone. The anger was fading. What remained was grief. And beneath that grief, something else. A chance to become a family again. For the first time since Margaret died, all 5 of them sat together at the same table, not discussing money, not discussing property, not discussing inheritance, just sitting, listening, and finally beginning to understand one another. The test was over. The healing could begin. The farmhouse felt different after the family meeting. Nothing about the property had changed. The fields still stretched toward the horizon. The grain elevators still stood against the Kansas sky. The wind still moved through the prairie grass exactly as it always had. Yet something inside the house had shifted. For the first time since Margaret's death, silence no longer felt empty. It felt peaceful. The following morning, Walter officially moved back into the farmhouse. Samuel Whitaker helped carry the last of his belongings from the Prairie Creek trailer. There weren't many. A few boxes. The windows rattled whenever Kansas winds swept across the prairie. The notebook, the journal, and the blue curtains Grace had sewn. When everything was unloaded, Walter stood inside the living room and looked around. The house felt familiar again. Not because Margaret's absence hurt less, because her presence felt closer, as though she had been waiting for him to come home. A week later, Theodore Blake arrived with a briefcase full of documents. The attorney sat at the dining room table while Walter reviewed the final version of his estate plan. Are you certain? Theodore asked. Walter nodded. I've never been more certain. The structure was simple. Prescott Ridge Farm and the grain elevators would be placed into a family trust. Grace would become the primary steward, not because she was the favorite, not because she had won some competition, because she had proven she understood responsibility. The trust itself would benefit every grandchild equally. Emma, Jacob, Ethan, Andrew's children, any future grandchildren. The farm would remain what it had always been, a legacy, not a prize. Andrew, Victoria, and Nathan would each receive equal portions of Walter's investment portfolio. No penalties, no punishments, no conditions. For a brief time, Walter had considered doing otherwise. Then he remembered something Samuel had told him. Don't turn the rest of their lives into another test. So he didn't. However, Walter added one final page to the documents. Not a legal requirement, not a financial instruction, simply a request, written in his own handwriting. Sunday dinner. First Sunday of every month. The table is big enough. Come because you want to. Theodore smiled after reading it. I think Margaret would approve. Walter smiled too. I hope so. A few days later, he called each of his children. The conversations were surprisingly brief. Andrew thanked him. Victoria said she understood. Nathan was quiet for nearly 30 seconds before speaking. I don't deserve any of this. Walter's answer came immediately. It's not about deserving. What is it about? Belonging. Nathan didn't speak again for several moments. When he finally did, his voice sounded different. Later, the first Sunday dinner took place in July. Grace organized nearly everything. Of course she did. By noon, the farmhouse smelled exactly the way it had when Margaret was alive. Roast beef, mashed potatoes, fresh bread, green beans, homemade pie. The kitchen overflowed with activity. Nathan arrived first, then Victoria. Andrew arrived last with Charlotte and their children. For a few awkward moments, everyone stood around unsure of what to say. Then Grace handed Nathan a bag of potatoes and told him to start peeling. Victoria was assigned vegetables. Andrew was told to set the table. Within minutes, everyone was working, talking, laughing occasionally. The awkwardness slowly disappeared. Dinner itself was imperfect. The table wasn't large enough. Extra chairs had to be borrowed. Jacob spilled milk. Emma accidentally knocked over a basket of rolls. Everyone laughed. Nobody cared. Walter sat at the head of the table. For nearly 2 years, he had avoided that seat. It had belonged to Margaret. Now he finally understood something. Margaret had never sat there because she controlled the family. She sat there because she connected it. And now someone needed to continue that work. As the meal continued, Walter looked around the room. Andrew discussing business with Daniel. Victoria helping Emma with homework questions. Nathan cutting food for Jacob. Grace moving through the kitchen carrying dishes. The scene wasn't perfect. Families never were. But it was real. And that mattered more. Later that evening, after everyone else had gone home, Grace remained behind. She always stayed a little longer. The two of them sat on the porch watching the sunset. Golden light spilled across the fields. The grain elevators cast long shadows over the land. Walter disappeared inside for a moment. When he returned, he carried a small wooden box. Margaret's recipe box. He placed it in Grace's lap. Her eyes widened immediately. Dad, your mother wanted you to have it. Carefully, Grace opened the box. Hundreds of recipe cards rested inside. Handwritten notes, family favorites, holiday meals. Decades of memories. Near the back, she found a sealed envelope. Her name appeared on the front in Margaret's handwriting. Grace looked at Walter. He shook his head. I never opened it. Slowly, she unfolded the letter. The porch became silent. Walter watched her read. Her expression changed gradually, not dramatically, quietly, deeply. When she finished, she pressed the letter against her chest. Tears filled her eyes. What did she say? Grace smiled through the tears. It's between me and Mom, Walter nodded. That seemed fair. After a moment, Grace laughed softly. But she did say one thing. What? Grace looked toward the farmhouse, then toward the fields, then back at her father. She said she wasn't worried about me. Walter smiled. That sounds like your mother. Grace nodded. She said she was worried about you. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The evening breeze moved gently through the prairie. Crickets sang in the distance. Inside the farmhouse, laughter still seemed to linger in the walls. Walter leaned back in his chair and looked out across the land he had spent a lifetime building. For years, he had believed his greatest achievement was 600 acres, 3 grain elevators, a successful business, a valuable estate. He understood now how wrong he had been. Those things mattered, but they weren't the legacy. The legacy sat around his table. The legacy laughed in the yard. The legacy called him Dad, Grandpa, family. As darkness settled across the prairie, Walter touched the wedding ring hanging from the chain around his neck, a habit he had developed after Margaret's funeral. "You were right," he whispered. The wind carried the words into the evening. Somewhere upstairs, he heard Emma laughing, Jacob asking for water, Grace telling them it was bedtime. Life, simple life, the kind Margaret had always treasured. Walter stood from the porch chair. The house glowed warmly behind him. For a moment he looked once more across the fields. Then he turned away from the darkness and walked inside. Into the light, into the warmth, into the family that had nearly been lost. And finally, after 2 long years of grief, regret, and lessons learned too late, Walter Prescott came home.